I had a one-night mistake with my brother-in-law, but he never let me forget it. He's been using it to control me ever since. I have always been known as the reliable one, the organizer, the woman who remembers everyone's favorite drink, who knows which cousins don't get along and seats them at opposite ends of the room, who keeps extra blankets in the hall closet because someone always ends up crashing on the couch. Our house has been the party house for as long as I can remember. Birthdays, holidays, random Saturdays that turn into something bigger than planned, it all somehow ends up at our place. People joke that we should charge admission. They call our home the hub, and they say it with affection, like it's something to be proud of. For a long time, I was proud of it. My husband loves to host. He loves the idea of it, at least. He's the one who invites everyone, who sends the group texts, who insists we have just one more get-together before summer ends or something small for the holidays, knowing full well it will never be small. He thrives on the anticipation, the early buzz of the night, the clinking of bottles and the laughter when everyone first arrives. He's charming in those early hours. Loud, funny, generous. The kind of guy people gravitate toward because he makes everything feel like a celebration. But my husband is also a sloppy drunk. That's not something I used to say out loud. For years, I softened it. I told myself he just overdid it sometimes, or that he couldn't handle his alcohol like he used to. I'd laugh it off when friends joked about him being the first one down. I'd roll my eyes and say, "You know how he gets," like it was an endearing quirk instead of a pattern that shaped my entire life. Every party followed the same script. He'd start strong, pouring drinks, playing host, making toasts that went on too long. And then, without fail, he'd cross some invisible line. His words would slur. His movements would slow. Eventually, he'd disappear entirely, passed out in our bedroom or on the basement couch, snoring through the rest of the night he insisted on hosting. And then it would be on me. I'd be the one left standing in a house full of people, pretending everything was fine. I'd keep refilling bowls of snacks, wiping counters, breaking up heated conversations, making sure no one drove home when they shouldn't. I'd smile and nod and laugh at jokes I barely heard because I was already thinking about the mess I'd be cleaning up later. I'd gently usher people out at the end of the night, thanking them for coming, apologizing for my husband's absence in ways that didn't sound like apologies. After the door finally closed behind the last guest, I'd look around at the aftermath. Empty bottles. Sticky floors. Half-eaten food. And somewhere upstairs or downstairs, my husband, unconscious and unreachable. I'd clean until my body ached because if I didn't do it then, I'd wake up to it in the morning, and mornings after parties were never pleasant. This wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't even an occasional thing. It was every single time. At first, I told myself this was just marriage. That this was what compromise looked like. He worked hard. He liked to have fun. I was better at details, better at managing chaos. We balanced each other out, or at least that's what I told myself when I crawled into bed next to him at 3 a.m, exhausted and wired, staring at the ceiling while he slept soundly, oblivious. Over time, something shifted in me. I didn't notice it happening. There was no big moment where I realized I was unhappy. It was more like a slow erosion. Each party took a little more out of me. Each time I felt less like a partner and more like staff. I stopped enjoying the gatherings we hosted because I was always on edge, waiting for the moment he'd disappear and leave me alone to manage everything. I tried to talk to him about his drinking. I did it gently at first. I told him I needed more help, that it was hard being on all night by myself. He'd apologize the next day, swear he didn't remember passing out, promise he'd do better next time. And for the first hour or two of the next party, he always did. Until he didn't. When I pushed harder, when I told him how lonely it made me feel, he'd get defensive. He'd say I was exaggerating, that everyone had a good time, that I was too uptight. He'd remind me that people loved coming to our house, like that was proof enough that everything was fine. Eventually, I learned which conversations went nowhere and stopped having them. By the time the night that changed everything came around, I was already worn thin. I didn't feel dramatic about it. I felt numb. Tired in a way sleep didn't fix. I had been carrying the weight of our social life, our home, and the emotional labor of smoothing over his behavior for years, and I didn't even realize how much resentment had built up because I'd never given myself permission to name it. That night started like all the others. Too many people. Too much alcohol. Too much noise. My husband was in rare form early on, holding court in the living room, laughing louder than anyone else. I remember watching him from the kitchen as I prepped food, feeling that familiar mix of fondness and dread. I knew how this night would end. I always did. Sure enough, he was gone before midnight. One minute he was slumped in a chair, insisting he was fine. The next, he was being helped down the hall by someone who joked about him needing a quick power nap. I made a light-hearted comment, something about him being an old man now, and everyone laughed. I laughed too, because that's what I always did. Inside, I felt empty. The party kept going. Music played. People drifted in and out of conversations. I refilled drinks, cleaned spills, checked my phone, waiting for the night to be over. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that I wished I could just disappear into my own bedroom and sleep, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until everyone was safe and gone. This was my role. The dependable one. The responsible one. The woman who always had it together. I didn't realize how dangerous that role had become for me. I didn't realize how badly I needed anyone, to see me as more than the person who held everything up. I didn't realize how vulnerable exhaustion can make you, how it lowers your defenses in ways you don't recognize until it's too late. I look back now and I can see all the warning signs. The imbalance. The loneliness. The quiet resentment I swallowed to keep the peace. At the time though, it all felt normal. Just another party. Just another night I would survive and clean up after. I had no idea that by the time the sun came up, my life would be split into a before and an after. I wish I could say that what happened next was the result of some long-buried desire or a conscious choice. It wasn't. It was a collapse. A moment where exhaustion, loneliness, and a lifetime of swallowing my own needs finally caught up with me all at once. By the time most of the guests had filtered out, the house felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just hollow. There were still a few people lingering, talking in low voices, nursing the last of their drinks. I moved through the rooms on autopilot, collecting empty glasses, straightening cushions that didn't need to be straightened, doing anything to stay busy. My body ached. My head throbbed. I hadn't sat down all night. My husband hadn't stirred. He was exactly where he'd been left, passed out and unreachable, removed from the evening he'd insisted on creating. That familiar resentment bubbled up again, sharper this time because I was so tired I couldn't push it down like I usually did. That's when his brother came into the kitchen. We'd always gotten along. He was around often because of family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, another constant presence in my life by default. That night, he hadn't been drinking much. I remember noticing that, even then. He asked if I needed help cleaning up. It wasn't a loaded question, at least not on the surface. People had offered before. Usually, I said no. This time, I didn't have the energy to refuse. So he stayed. At first, it was mundane. He stacked plates while I wiped counters. We worked side by side in an easy, quiet way that felt different from the chaos of the party. No loud music. No shouting over laughter. Just the sound of running water and clinking dishes. I felt myself exhale for the first time that night. He asked if I was okay. Not in a casual throwaway way, but like he actually wanted an answer. Something in me cracked. I shrugged and said I was tired. He nodded, like he understood something I hadn't said out loud. He made a comment about my husband overdoing it again, and instead of brushing it off like I always did, I didn't respond. The silence hung there, heavy. When the last guests finally left, it was just the two of us standing in a half-clean kitchen. I should have told him thank you and gone upstairs. I know that now. At the time, I felt frozen. Like if I stopped moving, everything I'd been holding back would spill out. He poured me a glass of water and told me to sit down. I did. That alone should have been a warning sign. How quickly I obeyed, how desperate I was for someone else to take control for once. We talked. About nothing important at first. Then about everything. I told him I was exhausted. I told him how lonely I felt sometimes, even in a full house. I didn't accuse my husband of anything outright, but I didn't defend him either. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to soften the truth. He listened. He didn't interrupt or joke it away. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. That's the part that still messes with my head. How validating it felt. How good it felt to be seen. The line blurred slowly. There was no dramatic moment where everything suddenly changed. It was a series of small steps I didn't stop. Sitting closer. A hand on my arm that stayed there too long. Eye contact that felt heavier than it should have. I remember thinking fleetingly that I should leave. That this was a bad idea. That I would regret it. And then I stopped thinking at all. I don't want to romanticize what happened. There was no passion that swept me away. It was clumsy. Quiet. Fueled by exhaustion and a need for comfort I hadn't admitted I was starving for. The moment it was over, reality crashed back in. I felt sick. My stomach dropped like I'd stepped off a ledge. I remember sitting alone afterward, staring at the kitchen table, replaying everything in my head. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. I kept thinking, what have I done? How could I do this? This isn't who I am. I thought about my husband upstairs, unconscious and unaware, and the shame burned so hot it was almost physical. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed next to my husband, listening to him breathe, staring at the ceiling just like I had after so many parties before, but this time, everything felt irrevocably different. I felt like I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been a terrible, isolated mistake. A one-time lapse under extreme circumstances. I avoided his brother completely. I didn't answer his messages at first, then finally replied with short, careful responses that made it clear I didn't want to talk about what happened. A month later, I asked to meet him. I wanted it over and done with. I told him plainly that it was a mistake, that it could never happen again, and that we both needed to forget it. I said it with as much firmness as I could muster, my hands shaking the entire time. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he felt the same way. I believed him. For a brief moment, I thought I had handled it. I thought the worst was behind me. I told myself I didn't need to confess because I wasn't going to do it again. That bringing it up would only hurt my husband for no reason. I told myself that protecting my marriage meant burying this and moving on. What I didn't understand then was that the night didn't end when I said no. It was just the beginning of something I wouldn't know how to escape. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with a message from him. Casual at first. Then suggestive. Then insistent. I ignored it. Then another came. And another. When I finally responded and told him to stop, his tone shifted. He reminded me of what we'd done. He told me he had proof. Old texts. Photos I barely remembered taking. He said it calmly, like it was just a fact, not a threat. He told me my husband deserved to know the truth. He told me I could make it easy, or I could make it messy. That was the first time I felt real fear. I hadn't just made a mistake. I had handed someone else power over my life, and I didn't yet understand how much they were willing to use it. After that message, everything in my life became measured in risk. Every sound from my phone made my chest tighten. Every family gathering felt like walking into a room where I might be exposed at any second. I started living two lives without ever meaning to, one on the surface, where I was still the dependable wife and hostess, and one underneath, where I was constantly calculating how to keep everything from collapsing. At first, I tried to regain control the way anyone would. I told him no. Clearly. Repeatedly. I said what happened was a mistake and that his messages were inappropriate. I told him I loved my husband and that I was not going to do this again. I expected anger or embarrassment, maybe even shame. What I got was calm persistence. He told me I was overreacting. He told me I was being unfair. He said we both knew what we felt, that I was just scared. And then, almost casually, he'd remind me that my husband didn't know. That it would break him. That people would look at me differently if they found out. He didn't have to spell it out every time. The implication was always there. The first time I gave in after that, I cried afterward. Not quietly, not in a dignified way. I sobbed like someone who had just realized they were trapped. I told myself it was temporary. That I just needed time to figure out a plan. That once things cooled down, he'd lose interest. He didn't. Instead, the dynamic hardened. He stopped pretending this was mutual. He'd tell me when he expected to see me. He'd get angry if I hesitated. If I didn't respond quickly enough, he'd remind me what he could do. He never raised his voice. He never had to. The threat did all the work. I started trying to protect myself in small, desperate ways. I blocked his number, only to have him reach out through social media or email. I deleted accounts. I avoided family gatherings, making excuses about migraines, work, anything that would keep me from being in the same room as him. When avoidance wasn't possible, I stayed glued to my husband's side, terrified of being alone even for a minute. Once, I pulled him aside at a family event and told him to leave me alone. I remember how hard my heart was pounding, how I was sure someone would overhear us. He smiled and told me to relax. He said I was making a scene. Later that night, I found a message waiting for me, reminding me again of what he had saved. That was when I understood something that still makes my stomach turn. Saying no didn't matter anymore. Each time I tried to end it, the consequences felt unbearable. I imagined my husband's face if he found out. The disappointment. The betrayal. I imagined the story spreading through our family, the whispered conversations, the way I would be reduced to a single unforgivable choice. I told myself that enduring this was the lesser evil. That I was protecting him, protecting our marriage, even if it meant sacrificing myself. Years passed like this. Not in a dramatic blur, but in a suffocating routine. Long stretches where nothing happened, where I almost convinced myself it was over, followed by messages that dragged me right back under. Each time felt worse than the last. I felt complicit, even when I knew I wasn't choosing it freely. The guilt never faded. It layered itself on top of fear until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I stopped recognizing myself. I became quieter, more withdrawn. I avoided mirrors because I hated the person looking back at me. I smiled through holidays and dinners and parties, all while carrying a secret that felt heavier every year. I was constantly bracing for impact, waiting for the moment everything would explode. What made it worse was how normal everything else looked. My husband had no idea. He trusted me completely. He still talked about the future, about growing old together, about how lucky he was. Every time he said it, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I tried to convince myself that this was my punishment. That this was what I deserved for that night. But punishment is supposed to end. This didn't. It just hollowed me out a little more each time. There were moments I thought about telling my husband everything. Standing in the kitchen, watching him drink his coffee, I'd imagine blurting it out just to make it stop. Other times, I thought about disappearing. Starting over somewhere no one knew me. Both options felt impossible. I didn't see myself as someone having an affair. That word never fit. This wasn't secret romance or passion. It was survival, compliance, fear. But I also couldn't escape the reality that I had caused the opening that allowed this to happen, and that knowledge kept me silent. By the time I realized how much damage this had done to me, 8 years had almost passed. 8 years of living under a threat that never needed to be repeated to be effective. 8 years of being controlled by something I couldn't undo and didn't know how to escape. I wasn't just hiding a secret anymore. I was disappearing inside it. By the time I realized how deeply this had changed me, I was already someone else. On the outside, nothing looked wrong. Our life moved forward in all the expected ways. We still hosted parties. I still showed up for birthdays and holidays with a smile on my face and food in my hands. People still told me how lucky my husband was, how welcoming our home felt, how they loved the energy we created together. I nodded and thanked them and carried those words like weights in my pockets. Inside, I was unraveling. I became an expert at compartmentalizing. There was the version of me who lived my daily life, went to work, paid bills, laughed at the right moments, listened when my husband talked about his day. And then there was the version of me who lived in constant anticipation of the next message, the next demand, the next reminder that I wasn't free. The two versions never touched, because if they did, I don't think I would have survived it. The guilt was relentless. It wasn't just about what I had done anymore, it was about what I was continuing to hide. Every time my husband trusted me, every time he reached for me without suspicion, it reinforced the lie I was living. I hated myself for it. I hated myself for being weak, for not blowing everything up just to make it stop. I told myself that if I were a better person, a braver person, I would have ended it by telling the truth. But fear is a powerful thing. Fear of losing my marriage. Fear of being judged by everyone we loved. Fear that no one would see the coercion, only the original betrayal. I imagined explaining it and watching people's faces harden, the way stories simplify when they leave your mouth and land in someone else's ears. I imagined my husband hearing only that I slept with his brother, not the years of pressure that followed. That fear kept me silent far more effectively than any threat ever did. Over time, my relationship with my husband changed in ways I couldn't explain to him. I pulled back emotionally. Physical intimacy became complicated, layered with shame and dissociation. Sometimes I felt like I was performing a role instead of sharing something real. Other times, I avoided closeness altogether, claiming stress or exhaustion. He noticed, but he didn't understand. He assumed it was work, or age, or life catching up to us. I let him believe that. His drinking never truly changed. Parties still ended the same way, with him passed out early and me handling the fallout. In a cruel way, that familiarity made everything else easier to hide. I was already used to carrying things alone. This was just one more thing, bigger, darker, but still mine to manage. I started losing interest in things I used to enjoy. Music played in the background without registering. Conversations blurred together. I felt disconnected from my own body, like I was watching my life from a distance. There were days I couldn't pinpoint what I was feeling at all, just a constant low-grade heaviness that followed me everywhere. I thought about therapy more than once. I even looked up counselors online late at night, scrolling through profiles and wondering how I could possibly explain any of this without saying the words out loud. I'd close the browser every time. The idea of speaking it into existence terrified me. As long as it stayed in my head, it was still contained. Family gatherings were the worst. Sitting around the same table, laughing at the same jokes, knowing what no one else knew. Watching my husband interact with his brother like everything was normal. Watching his brother look at me like he owned a piece of me. I learned how to avoid eye contact. How to keep conversations short. How to excuse myself to the bathroom just to breathe. Sometimes, I wondered if anyone noticed how different I'd become. If they saw how much quieter I was, how guarded. If they chalked it up to maturity, or stress, or just assumed this was what happens over time. No one ever asked. Or if they did, I brushed it off so smoothly they didn't push. I carried a constant sense of impending doom, like I was always one step away from disaster. I'd rehearse conversations in my head that never happened. I'd imagine worst-case scenarios until they felt almost normal. In some twisted way, the waiting became its own kind of torture. I was always braced for impact, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And yet, year after year passed without it happening. That almost made it worse. Because with time came the question I couldn't escape. If this hasn't come out yet, does that mean it never will? And if it never does, am I really going to live the rest of my life like this? I started to resent my husband in ways that felt unfair and confusing. Part of me blamed him for his drinking, for leaving me alone that night, for never noticing how much I was struggling. Another part of me felt fiercely protective of him, determined to shield him from the pain I believed the truth would cause. Those two feelings existed side by side, tangled together, impossible to separate. There were nights I lay awake next to him, listening to him sleep, wondering how someone could be so close to me and yet know nothing about the most defining thing in my life. I wondered if our marriage was already ruined, even if he didn't know it yet. If trust still existed when one person was carrying a secret this big. I questioned my own responsibility constantly. I knew I had made a terrible choice. I owned that. But I also knew that what followed wasn't something I chose freely. Holding those two truths at the same time felt impossible. I didn't feel like a victim, but I didn't feel like a willing participant either. I lived in that gray space, unsure where I fit, unsure what I was allowed to feel. The longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine a clean ending. 8 years is a long time to keep a secret. Long enough for it to reshape you. Long enough for fear to feel like a personality trait instead of a reaction. By the time I reached the point where I couldn't do it anymore, where the weight of it all felt unbearable, I wasn't just afraid of losing my marriage. I was afraid of losing myself entirely. And that was when I realized that staying silent wasn't neutral anymore. It wasn't protecting anyone. It was slowly destroying me, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. I reached a point where the fear stopped being sharp and became dull, constant, like background noise I could never turn off. That scared me more than the threats ever did. Fear is supposed to warn you, to push you to act. When it settles in and becomes familiar, it means something inside you has given up. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single dramatic event that pushed me over the edge. It was smaller things. Forgetting what it felt like to be genuinely relaxed. Catching my reflection in a window and not recognizing the woman staring back. Realizing that I was planning my life around avoiding one person instead of living it. I started noticing how often I imagined escape. Not in a reckless way, not running off with anyone or starting a new life overnight. Just quiet fantasies of honesty. Of telling the truth and letting the consequences fall where they may. I'd picture myself sitting across from my husband, hands wrapped around a mug, saying the words out loud and finally being done with the hiding. Sometimes I'd imagine him yelling. Other times, him going completely silent. I never imagined forgiveness. That felt unrealistic, almost insulting to him. What surprised me was that, even in those imagined worst-case scenarios, there was a strange sense of relief. At the same time, the thought of actually doing it made me feel sick. My husband is not a bad man. He's flawed, yes. He drinks too much. He's careless in ways that have hurt me. But he has also loved me, trusted me, built a life with me. The idea of being the person who shattered that trust felt unbearable. I kept asking myself if sparing him the truth was an act of love or an act of cowardice. The pressure from his brother never fully stopped. It ebbed and flowed, but it was always there, lurking. Sometimes months would pass without a word, and I'd start to believe maybe he was done. Then a message would appear, casual on the surface, loaded underneath. Enough to remind me that I was still not free. I started to see the pattern more clearly. How he reached out when he sensed distance. How he escalated when he felt he was losing control. How every interaction was designed to keep me afraid enough to comply, but not so afraid that I'd explode and tell everything. Realizing that made me feel angry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. That anger was new. And dangerous. For years, I had turned everything inward. Blame. Shame. Fear. But anger points outward, and once it surfaced, I couldn't fully suppress it again. I started thinking less about how to protect everyone else and more about what this was costing me. I started asking myself why I was carrying all of this alone while the person exploiting it moved through life without consequences. Still, I was paralyzed. Knowing something is wrong doesn't automatically give you the tools to fix it. I considered telling someone else first. A friend. A therapist. Even just writing it all down in a place no one would see. But each option came with its own risks. Once another person knew, the secret would be real in a way it hadn't been before. Contained secrets feel manageable. Shared secrets feel volatile. My marriage felt like it existed in a fragile bubble. On the surface, we functioned. We talked about plans. We talked about the future. Sometimes we were even genuinely happy. But underneath all of it was this truth I was actively withholding, and that knowledge made everything feel provisional, like it could disappear at any moment. I began to wonder whether my husband deserved the choice I was denying him. Whether staying silent was actually protecting him, or just protecting me from facing the fallout of my own actions. That question haunted me more than anything else. At the same time, I knew how easily the story could be twisted. How quickly 8 years of coercion could be reduced to a single sentence: she slept with his brother. I knew how rarely nuance survives shock. I knew how often women in situations like this are asked why they didn't just leave, just tell, just stop. I ask myself those same questions all the time. Now I'm here, stuck at a crossroads I can't avoid anymore. I can feel myself reaching the limit of what I can carry. The depression isn't subtle anymore. The anxiety leaks into everything. I'm tired of living in reaction mode, tired of shaping my life around fear and silence. I love my husband. That's the part that makes this unbearable. If I didn't, the choice would be easier. I could burn it all down and walk away. But I don't want to destroy him. I don't want to destroy us. I also don't want to keep destroying myself. I don't know if there is a way out that doesn't hurt someone. I don't know if telling the truth now will set me free or just cause damage I can never repair. I don't know how to reclaim my life from someone who has held it hostage for so long. All I know is that I can't keep living like this. If you were in my position, what would you do?